Well, it's Friday, and I hope that you've had another good week. And if not, I hope that the weekend will get better, and Lord willing, have a better week next week. And hope that everybody will be able to gather together on Sunday to spend time and worship and praise to God. And with it being Friday, with our Friday focus, our focus on Jesus, and remembering Jesus and all about what he has done for us, we've recently been going through the book of Hebrews on Fridays, as the Hebrews writer was uh, really encouraging Christians who are struggling in their faith, and holding on to their faith and confession in Jesus. And we've been in Hebrews chapter 11, where the Hebrews writer is talking to them about living by faith and holding on to that faith. And he's been using examples of faith. He talked about Abel and Enoch and Noah. We last time looked at the faith of Abraham and that faith that was passed down to Isaac and Jacob and Joseph. And now the Hebrews writer talks about another prominent figure in the history of God's people. And that's what we're going to look at today, and that is in Hebrews chapter 11, picking up in verse 23, where now he wants to talk to them and us about the faith of Moses. And let's look together at what he says about Moses and about Moses' faith during all that he went through. We've actually recently been studying in our Wednesday night Bible classes. We've been studying through the book of Exodus, and we just recently talked about Moses and all that he went through, and being called by God and leading the people out of Egypt, and we're about to get to the crossing of the Red Sea. But let's look here at how the Hebrews writer describes the faith of Moses, when actually in verse 23, it's not the faith of Moses himself, but rather the faith of his parents, who certainly had great faith. As he says, by faith, Moses, when he was born, was hidden for 3 months by his parents because they saw that he was a beautiful child. And they were not afraid of the king's command, the command of Pharaoh, that the Hebrews were to kill their male babies. That's when Pharaoh and Egypt were trying to cut down on Israel's numbers that just continued to grow and increase. And Pharaoh gave the command. He tried to get the the Hebrew midwives to do it, but they wouldn't do it. They were actually a great example of faith as well. But then Moses' own parents were unwilling to kill their baby boy. And so the Hebrews writer acknowledges their faith, that they were not afraid of the king's command and the consequences that could come with it if they didn't. And they hid him for 3 months, about as long as they felt they could. And then we remember when when Moses was then hidden by his mother, and the bulrushes are set out there in the water. But the faith of his parents, which then, by faith, when Moses became of age, because what happened to Moses was when they could hide him no longer, they put him out in the bulrushes. Pharaoh's daughter found him, adopted him, raised him, but a time came, and this is what the Hebrews writer focuses on. Moses, when he became of age, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. What he's talking about is, and as we read in the account, Moses knew who his people were. Moses knew where he came from. Moses, and the choices he made in trying to help his people, was still choosing to be one of them, and not one of the Egyptians, not Pharaoh's daughter's son. And so it says, the Hebrews writer says of Moses that he refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin, the temporary pleasures of sin. Moses, Moses could have had anything he wanted. I mean, Moses could have lived it up, had a great life in Pharaoh's house. He could have had wealth and pleasures and anything he wanted. But Moses, because of his faith in God, his love for God and his love for God's people, thus Moses' people, Moses was unwilling to do that. Moses was unwilling to just live a life of pleasure and sin, but instead chose to be faithful to God, faithful to his people, choosing rather to suffer with his people than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin, esteeming the reproach, he says, esteeming the reproach and the reviling of Christ because of the greater riches that were greater than the treasures of Egypt, for he looked to the reward. Again, Moses was willing to suffer with his people. Moses was willing to suffer what the Hebrews writer calls the reproach of Christ. He esteemed the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt, for he looked to the reward. Moses was willing to suffer. And the reason the Hebrews writer says it this way especially is for these Christians he's writing to who seem to have been suffering for Christ. And he's trying to say, listen, look what Moses was willing to do. Moses was willing to give up the treasures of Egypt to instead suffer with God's people, to suffer with Christ. So by faith he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king. For he endured as seeing him, that is God, who is invisible. Moses, like his parents, like the midwives, did not fear the king, did not fear the consequences, but rather he forsook Egypt and endured through this, knowing that God is faithful, that God who is above all, that God can do anything. And then later, when he became leader when God chose him to lead the people out of Egypt, it says by faith he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of blood, lest he who destroyed the firstborn should touch them on the 10th plague. If you remember that, or you can look back at that, we recently just looked at it on Wednesday night in our Wednesday night Bible class. And how God told Moses to tell the people to keep this Passover and to put the blood on the doorpost and the lintel of the house, and so that when the destroyer came, when God came to kill the firstborn of Egypt, it would not happen to those of Israel. And Moses was faithful in carrying out those instructions by faith. And finally, verse 29, by faith they, Moses leading Israel, passed through the Red Sea as by dry land, whereas the Egyptians attempting to do so were drowned. Moses had faith in God. As a matter of fact, when they left Egypt and then God told them where to go, and they wound up against the Red Sea, and then they got cornered by the Egyptians and the people were afraid, Moses said to them, be still and see the salvation of the Lord. God's got this. And then when God told Moses, you raise up the staff and I'll part the waters and you'll be able to cross through the sea on dry ground, Moses did it. And Moses led the people through the Red Sea on dry ground. The people by faith followed Moses on dry ground through the Red Sea. Of course, then God causing the waters to fall back and to destroy the Egyptians. And Israel saw that, Moses saw that, and they rejoiced in God. They had faith in God. The Hebrews writer uses Moses, another prominent figure that these brethren would have known very much so about and looked up to. Look at the faith of Moses, he says. Look at what Moses, and go back and read the account Look at the things Moses went through. Now, Moses, just like Abraham and all these other characters, he was not a perfect man. Moses did not have perfect faith. Faith was a journey. Faith was a learning process. But Moses had faith. Moses came to faith. His parents had faith. In the face of great consequences and challenges. And that's the point the Hebrews writer is trying to make, and us today. That no matter what we're facing today, we've got to face it and get through it and endure it in faith in God, knowing that God is greater, knowing that God will be with us, that God will bless us with that great home with Him in heaven. No matter what we face in this life, no matter what we may go through, but we've got to face it in faith, get through it in faith. Be willing to endure with Christ and being willing to be faithful to God no matter what. Let's look at the example of Moses ourselves. Let's be encouraged by his faith. And let's grow in our own faith and faithfulness to God. God bless.